So I'm afraid we're going to go by default to option 2, and that is to try to lower the debt over time by allowing inflation to be higher than it has been. Now, when you say, I'm going to allow high inflation, then financial markets would anticipate by, for example, forcing the long-term interest rates up, which would not only help you solve the problem you have, but make it even worse. So you have to play that game in a very sophisticated way by, at the same time, allowing inflation to go higher, but you keep saying to the people that if inflation goes up, you will act upon it. And that's exactly what you see what the Fed is doing now.
Welcome to the Gold Republic Podcast. My name is Bart Brands.
And I'm Alexei Jordanov. In our weekly podcast, we invite guests from all over the world to get valuable insights
into the emergence of a new monetary system through the lens of precious metals, cryptocurrencies, and other financial instruments. If we look at the past, for example, the past 50 years, and this game that we started in 1971, we see rules changes. We see the people in charge, making up new rules while the game is being played. My question always is, why haven't they learned from, for example, what you are doing? Is it because they are trapped? Is it because they think they're doing the best what they can? Is it extend and pretend, hoping for a miracle?
If you were in the shoes of somebody at the ECB now, or the Fed now, I think you would be feeling exactly the same way they are feeling now. If you were to do what Volcker did at the end of the 70s and to increase interest rates now, you know that would cause a lot of harm. Because of the high debt. So the problem is not central bankers not willing or not being able to increase interest rates. You have to look through that and to ask yourself, why are they not able? Why are they not willing? And the reason is those high debts. So that's the real problem we're having. So the only way you can make it possible for the Fed or the ECB or any other central bank for that matter to start increasing interest rates in the future without causing harm to the financial markets, to the GDP and everything else we like, is to diffuse the bomb, which is the high debt. So you have to find a way how to solve that. Now, in theory, there are a couple of ways you can do that. The first one, and the nicest way possible, is that your GDP growth becomes very high year after year, which would mean that the debt you're having would decrease as a percentage of GDP. So that's the nicest way you could have. Sadly, it's also the way that is not likely to be happening, because you would need exceptionally high GDP growth year after year. So what's the second best option? Well, the second best option is to try to decrease the debt by letting inflation eat it year after year after year, just a little bit every year. Inflation rate of 1% doesn't do much on that field. So you really need 2%, 3%, maybe even 4% every year. That would help decrease the debt levels, but it would have as a consequence, it would hurt the regular guy.
Yeah, the consumer.
Because he would be trapped in a situation where his income is increasing, but the increase is lower than the increase of the rate of inflation every year. So you feel your wage is going up, but in real terms it's going down. The third way you could solve the problem of high debt is, I would say, the least popular way, and that would mean to say to those countries which have high debts, we're going to write it off.
Default.
Not default, but just you go to Spain or to Greece
Haircuts.
and you say to them, you owe me X amount of money. You know what? The half of it you don't have to repay to me. That would solve the problem, but it is highly unpopular because you would have to explain to the Dutch people why the government here is increasing taxes to keep our national debt low, while at the same time you are saying to Greece, by the way, you don't have to pay us back all the money you owe to us. So at the end of the day, you have to choose between option 1, option 2, and option 3, knowing that option 1 is only option in theory, because high GDP growth year after year is just not going to happen. So in real life, you're left with option 2 and option 3. Option 3 is something no politician would dare to propose, because in the short term it would mean that he or she will not get elected. The main reason of a politician to do anything. So I'm afraid we're going to go by default to option 2, and that is to try to lower the debt over time by allowing inflation to be higher than it has been. Now, when you say, I'm going to allow high inflation, then people, financial markets would anticipate by, for example, forcing the long-term interest rates up, which would not only help you solve the problem you have, but make it even worse. So you have to play that game in a very sophisticated way by, at the same time, allowing inflation to go higher, but you keep saying to the people that if inflation goes up, you will act upon it. And that's exactly what you see what the Fed is doing now. The Fed right now is faced with 5% annual inflation. The first thing the Fed is saying is, we think the inflation will go down in 6 months' time. The second thing they are saying is, well, we actually need a little bit of more inflation. The third thing they're saying is, well, when you talk about inflation, that's not the number we are looking at. We are looking at another level. We are looking at a number which is different from the CPI inflation, and the numbers the Fed is looking at is actually lower than the CPI. So the Fed can also say, well, 5% inflation, you say it's 5%, but the index we're looking at says it's only 4%. So you get all those kinds of things that are used to try to keep the situation going on where you allow inflation to become somewhat higher, while at the same time you keep saying to the people, the ordinary man and woman on the street, you can rest assured, I am making sure that inflation does not eat into your wage. That's a game, it's a very hard game to play, because if at any time people lose confidence in you, basically say you're lying, then you risk those long-term rates to go up and to make the problem you're having even more severe than it is now. And I think one of the most exciting things this year and next year will be to see how long can the Fed keep playing this game by convincing the markets and convincing the people that they will act if inflation go up, while at the same time inflation is at 5%. It hasn't been higher since 1990. So that's a long time ago.
And where do we see this? There's many assets that we talk about asset inflation, and we also talk about bubbles that form in those environments. If you look at the stock market, it constantly hits all-time highs, even though we were practically in a recession when we looked at numbers in 2020 and parts of 21. What is it? Where do we need to see to really be assured that disinflation exists, and what will happen as well when other factors such as wages, but also other consumer prices start rising, where the self-fulfilling prophecy of what consumers, business owners, and pretty much any other market player within the economy, except institutions or governments, start realizing that inflation will be higher than what's been told to them.
It all boils down to trust in the Fed. Lots of people on the financial markets, they are not really worried about 4 or 5% inflation if and only if they trust the Fed to make sure that 4 or 5% inflation doesn't become the usual thing. So it will only become a problem if and when the trust in the Fed goes down. At this point in time, when I look at the long-term interest rates in the US, for example, if I look at the long-term interest rates in Europe, my conclusion based on that is, at this moment, there is sufficient trust in the Fed and the ECB and other central banks that they will indeed make sure inflation rates go down. There is no way we can predict what the inflation will do and how the Fed and the ECB will react. So I'm afraid this is a typical time will tell issue. And the good news is that time will tell does not mean in the next 4 or 5 years. The good news is that inflation rates of 5% in the US, the Fed says it's mainly due to one-off factors. And if that is true, those one-off factors influencing the annual inflation rate in the US should start to get out of the inflation numbers at the end of this year and in the first months of the next year. So we have to wait and see. If at the end of this year and in the first months of next year, inflation does not come significantly down from 5% to, say, 2%, then you will get in a very interesting situation where the Fed will not have the luxury by just saying they will do something, but they will have to do something. They will have to do what they have been saying all the time they will do. And it is only at that point in time that they will be forced either to say, this is what we have been saying we will do, and we will do it, or they will be forced to say, well, I don't think it would be wise to increase our rates right now. I think you should not forget that whatever they go for, either to do what they have been saying or not, it will have consequences. If they say, well, all the time we'll be saying, if inflation doesn't come down, then we will act. Acting means increasing interest rates. Now, if you increase interest rates after you have kept them for 10 years or more at 0%, you know that you have basically no idea how the financial markets will react to it, because they have been faced with 0% interest rates for 10 years. There are people on the financial markets investing money who have never witnessed a rate increase. So you don't know how they will react when they hear you saying, by the way, interest rates are going up. If you say, well, we've been saying we will act, but we will not, then the risk is that people in financial markets will conclude, you've been lying all those times to me. And that in itself would cause the long-term interest rates to go up, and what I've been saying, make the problem you have with high debt even more of a problem. So next year will be really exciting year for the Fed. Up until now, it's been easy going for the Fed and the ECB, because the only thing you had to do is lower interest rates, print more money, and you could always justify that by saying, look at the inflation rate. It was long time 0.5%, way too low for them. Look at the GDP. We're always in the kind of recession risk kind of situation. So we have to lower interest. We have to keep buying more stuff. For the first time in a long time, it looks like next year you will be faced with a situation where GDP growth is really high and inflation rate is really high. And then there is no way you can justify keeping interest rates at zero.
Yeah, I was just, it's fascinating. I wanted to ask you about, well, first of all, what would the reaction of normal people be? Because we've heard now for a long time that inflation rate is under control, CPI numbers lie, even though, well, if you measure them in the old style, inflation would be even higher. So people really feel inflation. Yeah. They can feel it. And could it result in a crisis of currency if, for example, the Fed next year says, we know we've been saying we will hike interest rates, but we're going to let inflation run for a little bit more?
Let me say two things about it. CPI index lying about inflation, I think that's a bit too much. CPI inflation, no. If you were to ask me, is CPI inflation perfect measure of inflation? No. At the same time, the fact that the measurement of inflation changes in the course of years is up to a point logical, because the environment changes. We change what we spend our money on. So you have to keep the CPI modern. Now, there is a point up to, you could say, well, that's logical. Maybe we have kept it more modern than we should have. I don't know. That's the first part. The second part of your question is, what would happen? You have made a mistake as a central bank in the past, and you cannot go back in time and do something else than what you have done. And the mistake has been that the interest rates have been kept at 0% for way too long. So that's the fact. There is nothing you can change about it. That means that you don't have the luxury of saying right now, I'm going to increase interest rates. But there is a responsibility you have to the society to look at the long term. And your responsibility, I would say, would be to say to the society, do not count on us keeping interest rates at zero forever. So you have to prepare the people in the financial markets for a situation where interest rates will have to go up. And this is where we could also go back to Mr. Volcker again, because what he said in 1979, do you remember, in the parliament in the US, the only remedy for high inflation is the standard of living of an average American has to go down. I think that those are the words that we need to hear right now, because that's the only way to solve the problem we are faced with. At the end of the 70s, we have had one guy who was prepared to say that and to act upon it. When I look at the central bankers right now, I don't see anybody who could even come close by to what Mr. Volcker not only said back then, but what he stood for back then.
So we've described all of what possibly can come, and we will see it coming now in the near term. What are the assets for all those people who are listening to us and are curious that they basically just also in general maybe started to be active in the financial market? Because you watch very closely how from a macro perspective and years ahead as well, 1 to up to 5 years, if I understood you well in our conversation earlier. And you're part of the board within your organization that is basically responsible for allocating certain assets.
Yeah.
How do you first see the image or the picture in the next 5 years, and how do you accordingly invest in certain assets? And of course, it always depends on everyone's risk-averse mix, but which assets do you look at, and which function do you see them attributed in the next 5 years? In
general, I would say one of the consequences of interest rates at zero and even negative interest rates is that you, as a central bank, you're forcing lots of people who in the past have made a decision to save and not to invest to go to invest now. So for lots of people, this is something new for them. And when you get those people come to you and ask, what should I do? You really have to be extremely responsible, because it's new for them. So you have to explain to them what they are doing, that investing over a long term, the chances are very high you would get a very good yield. But in the meantime, you could have some years with negative yield. That's the fact of life. There is nobody, either me or anybody else, that can change that. So that's the first thing. The second thing you have to explain to them is that the first lesson of investing money, which is spread your money over a lot of classes, stocks, bonds, gold, everything else, you have to spread it wisely. So it is never a good idea to put all your money into just one, either stocks or bonds or gold or silver. Spreading. Just spread your money, because then you are maximizing the chances of achieving good yield over time. Now, I can understand the feeling of lots of people that the stock prices are extremely high and the chances they will fall down is maybe really high as well. Maybe, I don't know. I think that expecting stock prices to really fall down in the next years would only be justified if you were expecting a kind of a deep and long recession, which I do not expect. And one of the reasons why I do not expect that over a medium term is again based on the book about 1971, because one of the lessons I've learned from looking at monetary history is that you have these time frames where we are all better off because of the technological change, etc. And there are signs you can see right now that most likely in the second part of the decade we will move to what is being called the fourth industrial revolution. And I wouldn't be surprised if because of that the economic growth would be high at that point in time and starting at the second part of the decade. So basically, if you're looking to escape the negative interest rates by choosing not to save anymore, but to invest your money, I would say spread the investments, because that maximizes your chances of reaching good yields in due time. There is another point as well, which is important to keep in mind. When you're faced with a situation as is now, with problems with high debts, aiming for as high yield as possible might not be the wise idea. Because you could aim for 7%, 8%, maybe even more every year if you invest it in very risky assets. So you always have to look not only what kind of yield do I want, but what kind of amount of risk am I willing and able to take. You have to sleep well at night, basically. Now, so maybe you should not aim for as high yield as possible, but be happy if you just see your money beat the annual inflation rate. So just keeping your money as is. The bad news is with high inflation we're seeing right now, that seems impossible. The good news is, as we show to the clients at the company I'm working for, it is possible. We're doing it every day.
Okay. And so gold and silver, for example, in that mix, how do you perceive that as a function of?
I think you looking into the future, you just have to keep in mind there is a chance that the governments and central banks will not be able to solve the problems they have, and not solving the problems they have would most likely be seen in a long period of high inflation rate. So making sure that a part of your portfolio is hedged against the possible high inflation rate in the future fits perfectly well in the mix I was talking about. So by mix, I do not mean stocks and bonds. Mix is more than that. Mix is stocks, bonds, and gold and silver as well.
Commodities in general as well.
Commodity in general. Okay. Because commodities have a long history of hedging against inflation. Mm-hmm. Now, will inflation be very high in the future? Nobody knows. Mm-hmm. I don't know it. You don't know it. Nobody. But that's really not the question you have to ask yourself. The question is, am I sure that the inflation will not be high in the future? Can I exclude that possibility? And I would say, no, you cannot exclude that possibility. And if you need any reason why you cannot exclude it, just look at what we are faced right now. In the US, we have inflation rate of 5%. It has not been higher since 1990. At the same time, the GDP growth in the US will reach almost 8% this year. Those kinds of GDP growth rates we haven't seen in a long time. So almost 8% growth, 5% inflation and increasing. And the Fed is saying we have absolutely no plans to do anything else than we have been doing for the last 10 years. That's reason enough for me to be able to say I cannot exclude the possibility that the inflation rate will be high in the future. And therefore, to include in the mix I was talking about other things than only stocks and bonds.
Last year, during the elections, you were also here. And we talked about...
the U.S. election.
Yeah, the U.S. election.
Yeah.
And we talked about what the central bank policy would be. I just wanted to say that you were right, because you said, well, I don't see any big change coming either way, whoever becomes president. So that was just, but I would like to ask a short reflection upon, first of all, seeing this as a example of fiscal and monetary policy
joining hands.
Yes, yeah. Merging.
Yeah, I mean, we are now in a situation that former central bankers are ministers of finance, as in the US. We are in a situation where former politicians are in charge of the ECB. So those are the signs of the merger between the two worlds, which ideal setting, we would like to keep those apart. When I look at the Fed now, when I look at the plans of the Fed, there is really nothing that I could use to say to you now, well, there are signs that the Fed is thinking about increasing interest rates in the near future. And near future is, by the way, not the rest of this year. It includes next year as well. One of the interesting and I think important things for next year for us all and for the viewers is the question, will the chairman of the Fed, Jerome Powell, be the chairman of the Fed next year? Because his term as a chairman expires in February 2022. Now, it's the President of the United States who has to nominate the chair of the Fed. The President now can renominate Chairman Powell for the next 4 years. At the same time, Chairman Powell has been made chair of the Fed by a Republican president, and Chairman Powell is a Republican himself. So, among all those shifting things in the markets, as an investor, you also have to keep in mind and to think about it. Will there also be a change at the helm of the Fed next year? Because if it turns out to be the case, then you have a whole new dimension of things you have to look at. Who will be the next chair? Who is he or she? What kind of policy does he or she stands for? And that is something that will also be solved after the summer, because somewhere after the summer, the President of the United States will have to hint or to say, yes, I will renominate Chairman Powell, or I am going to look for another chair of the Fed. So that's something you also have to keep in mind the rest of this year.
As dynamic and explosive 2020 was, even 2022 promises to be really exciting in a monetary policy way.
Because, I mean, if you, as a viewer, if you take one thing from this conversation we're having now, please let it be the following. Up until now, since 2007, the life of central bankers was easy because you had no other option than to decrease interest rates and start quantitative easing and then increase the amount of quantitative easing, because that was what was expected from you because of the chances of recession and low inflation rate. For the first time in 15 years, the situation has changed. For the first time in 15 years, you are faced not with low and decreasing inflation, but with high and increasing inflation. For the first time in 15 years, the main economic problem is not whether we will have a recession or not. The main problem in the US is, will the US economy be overheated or not? That is not a situation where 0% interest rate and quantitative easing is the best policy you can have. And it will be first time since 2007 that you have, as a central banker, you have to make really hard decisions. Up until now, it was easy sailing. Starting from next year, the life is going to be much harder for them.
Edin Mujagić, thank you very much for having or being our guest on this Gold Republic podcast. If you've liked this episode, please give it a like. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, please do. If you liked the episode and you have a question or comment, down below in the description box or in the comment section.
If you've listened to this episode on Spotify, iTunes, or any other podcast platform, feel free to leave us a review. We much appreciate it. You can also forward this episode to any other person you find this interesting to. And
up until then, we will see each other in the next episode of the Gold Republic podcast.